not the data breach, no.
Okay. That might be one you might want to, add to that. And then did you identify the common threats that you might face, like in this local area?
Yeah.
And did you identify the types of different, like natural disasters too, besides other kinds of crises? Did you identify that?
Yes.
Okay. And what was one?
An earthquake.
Okay. Okay. Oh, earthquake potential
Or
here.
natural disaster.
For fallout, I guess, from earthquake zone, where you'd have the fallout effect of the population from the west coast?
We have
We've had
huge
2
amount.
earthquakes here since I've
Whoa.
been here.
Well, see, from
a lot.
Earth, what I learned, and I was mistaken by, I go, oh, we're pretty good because we're on basically an underground lake. Someone told me, they says, no, that actually will make things worse.
Oh, right.
Oh.
And I says, oh, really? So for a major earthquake, we're worse off than if we didn't have.
Yeah, and
Water
there's a
underneath us.
lot of crisscrossing faults up in the Silver Valley area too that people don't realize because they haven't been active, but the potential is great here.
And so,
Back to wells too.
and the
wells.
well water.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, the number one, when you look at analysis, is the population distribution coming from the larger cities. That's probably the biggest vulnerability that we have here. Remember we talked about that? What happens if Seattle and Portland evacuate to the east?
Yeah.
And so that's why, last summer they did the practice thing where it was a whole regional practice, if you remember, and they did it at the fairgrounds, but all these officials came from the West Coast because they want to know that we're prepared over here because that's where their people are coming.
Yeah, we have the best weather in the nation right now. So it's
Yeah, really.
And they thought it was nice to come here too.
Yeah.
Okay, and so then what was the top hazard that you kind of came up with then, Paul?
One of them is the children's ministry.
Okay, but so for the church itself here, not looking at the city now, but for the church's own hazard or key vulnerability, it would be the the children's area for their own security. Okay. And then what are the assets that are at risk, do you think?
Well, you have our church facility here at risk, and then you also have personnel risk.
Yes. So people and facility, and people and property. Okay. And what do you think would be the degree of impact if we were to have, like, on Sunday, if we were to have an active shooter on a Sunday versus a Wednesday? If we were to have an active shooter event here on a Sunday versus a Wednesday?
Oh, it's significantly worse. And that's another risk that we had looked at, was an active shooter in this facility.
So active shooters are what law enforcement kind of keeps them up at night in terms of that is like a number one, that and the IEDs, the explosions going off, which is why we did the security conference call, nationwide a few weeks ago, because the vulnerability of our church is actually experiencing, a suicide bombing is a lot greater now because the terrorists have put that out as a tactic, towards churches, and so that's a higher vulnerability. So then, who takes over if there is an active shooter? What is the approach? Who takes over, Paul?
Well, we'll do what we can to contain the incident, and then law enforcement will come in, and it's turned over to local law enforcement.
Okay. And then you follow it all the way through, though, don't you? All the way through to recovery of the entire congregation and the restoration of the ministry.
Right, and as I said to somebody else before, the event may just also be the beginning, because once the police come, they make the arrest, whatever, then they leave. Then you're left with the aftermath.
Right.
And depending upon what that is, you have to deal with that. And law enforcement's long gone, they're not coming back.
And they don't have a person that comes and deals with that.
Well, they might have somebody that will come and they're not gonna do it for you, but they might come as a community service officer and point you in directions, but they're not gonna sit here and provide any security for you. They're not going to deal with the aftermath. They handle the incident and that's it.
And even if they point you to public services, those public services are not necessarily Christ-based. And so we know that there isn't even the best counselor in the world, that without Christ, there's really no answer. And we know that. And so then we are the ones then that have to step in. So you see how the incident command becomes so key? So now just think of another scenario. Pastor's sick for a week. Is that a crisis?
Or on vacation.
But a vacation you knew though. But all of a sudden, no, pastor's sick, and you didn't know it, you know.
We call you. We come and tap you on the shoulder.
It's happened before.
know.
Yes, I know.
So see your experience.
Oh, yeah, see, there you go. And so how would that be different, though, than if a pastor was sick for 1 week, as opposed to all of a sudden we found out that the pastor had cancer? See? And then what would that scenario be? Who would take over? What are their responsibilities? Is this given, like, the duration of that? Would it be a volunteer? Would it be paid people? You know, who makes these decisions?
District superintendent?
Actually not. Not first. Not first. The local church, remember? A local church first and foremost, and you have a church board. But if a church board has never had any experience in incident response, do you think that they're going to know how to deal with some of these things? No, they're not. And that's why the church emergency team is so critical. It's so critical. And it's critical in non-emergency times too, because you're practicing the same, good principles of leadership. Okay, so would you then now kind of give just a little bit of a summary of those three things?
Okay. I need to be up there. That was a big introduction, Paul.
No, but I would just like you to think about, when he's talking, I'd like you to think about of a scenario, a fictitious scenario, and how is hearing this information helpful to you so that you would know how to respond in your area. So Jeannie, so you would know how to form prayer prompts. And Tom, you would know how to respond from a security or surveillance point of view. And Paul, how you would respond within the Sunday school classes, because they're almost like a second, like, congregational thing where prayer, care, and share takes place, in the smaller group setting. It's almost like the smaller little triage units. And Karen, think about what he's saying with that scenario that I gave you, how you would, you would lead, and you would make sure that everybody's doing their job and their role, right? And Mike, think about your operational, role and what you would be doing with that scenario, and really listening for what capacities are here and what capacities aren't here. And the same way also for you, Kathy, and be thinking of the PIO thing while you're thinking about the admin. Just do that too. And then Steve, in the whole finance area. Okay, so be thinking about that scenario of the tree coming down. 1/3 of the sanctuary is lost. It's flooded, and it's flooded because why? The fire people had to come here, and then they flooded out the sanctuary. And oh, by the way, when they did that, the water went also in there, and it took out, all the computers and all the data. Okay, so think of that scenario, and then tell us what we have and what we don't have.
Okay, initially, we looked at the assessment for this facility, and basically it's to understand what do we have here at this church, what can we offer, and give us a base look at if there was something major to happen in this region, what services could we take on here? Like, could we feed people out of the church, out of that little kitchen? Could we temporarily house people here if need be? Things like that. Then that leads us into our risk assessment. So on a security aspect, you have to kind of know.
Stand over here, Paul, so they can hear you better on the thing. Yeah.
So on a risk assessment for security-wise, you got to look at what incidents are we more apt to have to deal with, and then how would we approach it. And so one of the things that we looked at were the children's ministry, and talking about missing children and adopting and I can't even say it. Abduction. And there's a difference between the two. A missing child is not an immediate threat. you have to do stuff, and we walk through a process on if a child is missing, here's guidelines you should follow. Whereas if someone is taken, and we know that they're taken right now, your whole scenario is different. You now have an emergency, and some of the guidelines are the same, but then you have to start reacting immediately, such as calling 911 and things such as that. We looked at the child check-in system here, which we have a good check-in. Now, they haven't had any written policy. It's all verbal. So we took the verbal policy, put it on paper, and now we have a written policy for how to check children into this church. Another assessment that we looked at was pastoral safety. There is none. So we looked at what happens if there's a threat upon the pastor here in this church. And so we set guidelines out for that. Another important thing that isn't mentioned before is we have to establish guidelines for the whole team. Like, what is it that we're going to do? Who's in charge? Who does what? And so we have an idea of how to approach this facility on a Sunday service and approach it that way. Of course, if anything major were to happen, there would be more people here that were on security that maybe aren't working at the time that would then start and fall in and fall into place. What was interesting is that we met with Quest a couple weeks ago. And so you've got children here at this facility, and I provided information on a missing child, how to handle that, how to do an abduction, and some other guidelines such as an evacuation out of here. If you notice, we don't have any evacuation maps, we don't have anything like that. It would be very chaotic. And so we've established guidelines for that as well. So talking with these kids for Quest is that now they now have a understanding of what to do in an emergency. Now, you don't have to follow that whole thing, but I'll tell you, if you've ever been involved in an emergency and you have an idea what to do, you will be successful in following through because you don't fall onto chaos. You will remember, let's do these things, and ultimately, you'll do a lot better job than those people that haven't had any training whatsoever. If you want to look at, I keep referring back as to why should we have security in this place? And I can just take this church back, and you guys were around here. You know, we had a guy show up at this church who caused quite a stir because he wasn't like us. And one day, Saturday night, I got a phone call home, and it says, "Hey, Paul, you know, you're ex-cop. We need you to make sure you have your gun and come here because we're having a problem with this guy, and you'd really make everybody in the church feel better." Okay, I'll do that. Well, I think I was the 9th person that got the phone call. So what happened is I'm sitting in church and I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 guys get up. And I'm going, this is ridiculous. And my wife's just like, aren't you getting up? I go, there's too many guys already up. So I finally says, I need to get up. So I get up, come out here, and there's just a bunch of guys roaming around. And all I thought is, if something happens, what's going to happen? Are we going to have 9 guys take action? That's a disaster. For someone like me, that's a disaster. Because I don't know what I have to worry about this guy, and I have to worry about you and you, because I don't know what you're going to do. And you don't know what I'm going to do. My feeling is I'm going to take the approach, I'm going to handle this guy. Just be my backup, I got it. Where we might have other things happen. All it takes is one mistake to happen, and it turns completely into a disaster. That's one reason why we need a security team, which we have, where if an incident like that were to happen right now, it would be handled differently. You would have a team that kind of knows what to do. We haven't formulated everything yet, but we're close. We're close to getting done, and actually we want to show this to the board on July 1st. I hope I can get it in at that point in time. Our plan. Pastor Mark's read it. He likes it. And so that's where we're heading here. And so down the road, there's other things that will come up in this church that we're going to have to address. You know, Tom's on the team, and it's interesting. You don't have to be a police officer to understand security and come up with ideas. Tom's already done it several times. He says something, and I just laugh. I go, I didn't think of that. My mind's another place, and he'll bring up a point. So I think that we're heading in this right direction in this team. We've already addressed several items that are major to this church. And so, you know, I think we're getting close to wrapping this whole thing up with our security team and getting our plan together. So,
Can I ask you some questions?
yeah.
Okay, so what was the number one vulnerability that you said that we have, like in the church?
The first one's children,
Okay.
because they're very vulnerable.
Security of the children.
Yeah.
And so when you've analyzed that as a number one risk, then what capacities do we have and what are we doing to specifically address that?
One of the things for this is if there's an incident, an evacuation, dealing with children, how to handle, there's certain guidelines that have now come out, say if there is a fire or a shooting going down and you go into a lockdown, and identification with cards, which identify if you're okay or not okay, these types of things. And then also the check-in system to make sure that our check-in system is going to work for the children that we have here and in our risk. So it's a real good system. So we've come to the conclusion that some of the things that we have here are good, and then we just need to improve by having a plan on what to actually do should there be an incident.
So do we have a photo ID system for the children's area?
Right now, there's no photo ID. My understanding is that Quest has the capabilities of photos on the computer, but I never got, I don't know if they have them.
They never